Your computer is lying to you right now, not with a warning message, not with a flashing alert. It is doing it silently, invisibly in the background while you watch this video, while you work, while you sleep. And if you have Windows 11 installed on your machine, there's a very real chance that a single update, just one invisible software package that Microsoft quietly pushed to over 1 billion devices, is already destroying something on your system at this very moment. Before this video is over, you are going to know exactly what that update is, precisely what it is doing to your PC. How to find out in the next 5 minutes whether you are already affected, and the exact step-by-step process you need to follow to fix it before the damage becomes permanent and irreversible. And I promise you, by the time we get to what Nvidia's own engineers publicly admitted about this situation, you are going to be absolutely stunned that Microsoft has not been forced to answer for this in front of Congress. Stay right here, because the most disturbing part of this entire story is not the crashes. It is not the blue screens. It is what this update reveals about the way Microsoft treats the hundreds of millions of ordinary people who trust this company with the most important tool in their professional and personal lives every single day. Let us start from the very beginning, because to understand why this particular update is so catastrophic, you need to understand what it was supposed to do and why so many people installed it without a second thought. Every month, on the second Tuesday of the month, a day the technology world calls Patch Tuesday, Microsoft releases what the company calls a cumulative security update for Windows 11. These updates are framed as routine maintenance. They are supposed to patch security vulnerabilities, close backdoors that hackers could exploit, and make your system more stable and more protected than it was the previous month. Most of the time, these updates install quietly in the background, your computer restarts overnight, and you wake up the next morning with a machine that is supposedly safer and more reliable. That is the promise. You trust Microsoft with access to the deepest, most sensitive layers of your operating system, the code that controls how your processor allocates its resources, how your storage drives read and write data, how your graphics card renders every pixel on your screen, and in exchange, Microsoft is supposed to use that extraordinary level of access to make your system better, not worse, with every single update cycle. That is the deal. That is the foundation of the entire relationship between Microsoft and its users. On January 13th, 2026, Microsoft released KB5074109. According to the company's own release documentation, this update advanced Windows 11 versions 24H2 and 25H2 to operating system builds 26100.7623 and 26200.7623, respectively. The release notes highlighted over 100 individual security fixes contained within the package. It patched 3 actively exploited zero-day vulnerabilities, meaning 3 separate security holes that hackers were already actively using in the real world to attack Windows users at the moment the patch was released. It included improvements for devices equipped with neural processing units, the dedicated artificial intelligence chips built into modern laptop and desktop processors. On paper, reading through Microsoft's official communications about this update, it looked like exactly the kind of security-critical package that any responsible Windows 11 user should install immediately. Over 100 security patches, 3 actively exploited 0 days, AI hardware improvements. Microsoft certainly wanted you to think this was a critical, must-install update, because unlike some updates that are marked as optional and left to the user's discretion, KB5074109 was classified as mandatory. It installed automatically on affected devices, whether users wanted it to or not, silently in the background, without asking permission. And then the reports started arriving. Slowly at first, trickling into Microsoft's feedback hub and the major Windows community forums. Then faster. Then in a flood that turned those same community spaces into something resembling a disaster helpline for people whose computers had suddenly stopped working after doing exactly what Microsoft had programmed them to do automatically. The first wave of reports described black screens. Not the infamous blue screen of death that Windows has been generating since the earliest days of the operating system. Something different and in many ways more disorienting, because it was harder to interpret and harder to diagnose. After installing KB5074109, users across multiple hardware configurations and geographic locations reported that their computers would begin the startup sequence normally, the Windows logo would appear, and then, instead of the desktop loading cleanly and promptly as usual, the screen would go completely and unnervingly black for an extended and unpredictable period of time before eventually continuing to load. Some users reported waiting 30 uncomfortable seconds. Others reported waiting well over 2 minutes, staring at a black screen, not knowing whether their machine had frozen, whether Windows was working, or whether they should force a restart and potentially cause further damage. And then there was a third group, whose experience was even more alarming. For them, the black screen was not a delay. It was a permanent condition. Their computers simply stopped booting entirely after installing the update, leaving them with a machine that powered on but could never reach the desktop. Microsoft eventually confirmed in an updated support document what thousands of user reports had already established through painful personal experience. A portion of Windows 11 PCs were failing to complete the boot process after installing KB5074109. The specific error code appearing on many of these machines in Windows error logs was unmountable boot volume, cataloged as error code 0xED. This is among the most devastating errors that a Windows machine can generate, because it means the operating system cannot successfully access the storage drive, where Windows itself is installed during the startup sequence. The computer powers on, the firmware runs its initialization routines, the bootloader begins its work, and then Windows cannot locate itself. The machine is technically alive, but completely paralyzed, unable to proceed to a functional state. Microsoft's engineers determined that this catastrophic boot failure was not occurring randomly across all Windows 11 devices. It was specifically targeting machines that had previously experienced a Windows update that rolled back improperly, leaving the system's update management components in what Microsoft described as an improper state. Those machines had continued functioning without any obvious symptoms. Users had no warning that anything was structurally wrong beneath the surface. There was no error message, no performance degradation, no visible sign of a problem. Then KB5074109 arrived and attempted to install on top of this hidden structural inconsistency, and the result was machines that could no longer start Windows. Here is the detail that makes this situation genuinely damning for Microsoft, rather than simply unfortunate. The improper state that Microsoft is referencing was itself caused by a previous Windows update that had rolled back incorrectly. This means the full sequence of events looks like this. Microsoft released an earlier update. That update rolled back on certain machines during installation. The rollback process did not clean up after itself properly, leaving the system's update components in an inconsistent, internally contradictory state. The machines continued, operating normally. Users had no way of knowing their system was now carrying a hidden structural vulnerability. Then Microsoft released KB5074109, which, when attempting to install on a system already compromised by this earlier Microsoft-caused inconsistency, triggered a total boot failure. The damage was not caused by one bad update. It was caused by two successive Microsoft updates, where the first one created an invisible vulnerability and the second one detonated it. And none of this, not the initial rollback failure, not the resulting system inconsistency, not the risk that a future update could trigger a catastrophic failure, was communicated to users before, during, or for an extended period after KB5074109 was released and began installing itself on affected machines worldwide. But the boot failures, as dramatic and devastating as they were for the households and businesses that experienced them, affected what Microsoft characterized as a limited number of devices. What affected a dramatically broader population, likely tens of millions of Windows 11 users globally, was a category of damage that was less immediately catastrophic, but in many ways more corrosive, precisely because it was harder to definitively diagnose and attribute. It was the kind of subtle, persistent dysfunction that makes you less productive, more frustrated, and increasingly uncertain whether your computer is actually working correctly, without ever giving you a clean, obvious error message that tells you exactly what went wrong and why. Outlook, Microsoft's own flagship email client and one of the most widely used business productivity applications on the planet, stopped functioning correctly after KB5074109 on a scale that overwhelmed Microsoft's own support channels. Users with POP and SMTP email configurations, which represent the standard protocols used by the vast majority of personal email users, and small business email setups worldwide, found that after installing the update, Outlook would launch normally and then immediately display a not responding message in its title bar. The application would freeze completely, unable to send, receive, or display email. Some users discovered that Outlook would not open at all unless they first opened Task Manager, found every lingering Outlook background process still running from a previous session, and manually terminated each one before trying to launch the application again. Others found their Outlook generating duplicate email entries, populating their inbox with the same messages repeatedly on every launch. One user on Microsoft's official community Q&A forums described spending what she called an absolutely awful experience with her email since installing the January update, writing that she had lost hours of productive work time trying to understand what had happened to her computer, before eventually tracing the problem to KB5074109. She uninstalled the update. Outlook returned to normal operation within minutes. She restarted her computer the next morning. Windows automatically reinstalled the same broken update without asking. Outlook broke again. She was caught in a loop that Microsoft had engineered and Microsoft had not yet resolved. The cloud storage dysfunction that accompanied KB5074109 extended well beyond Outlook's PST file handling problems. Microsoft confirmed in its official known issues documentation that after installing the January 2026 cumulative update, certain applications would become unresponsive or generate unexpected errors, specifically and consistently when attempting to open files from or save files to cloud-based storage services, including OneDrive and Dropbox. Consider what that means in practical terms for the modern workforce. The entire architecture of contemporary remote and hybrid work is built on cloud storage. Documents are saved to OneDrive so they are accessible and synchronized across multiple devices. Files are stored in cloud services so teams can collaborate in real time. Business records, client files, financial documents, and creative projects are maintained in cloud storage as a fundamental safeguard against local hardware failure. KB5074109 introduced a bug that specifically and selectively targeted these workflows, causing applications to hang and become unresponsive the moment they attempted any interaction with cloud-backed storage. This affected not a narrow edge case of unusual hardware combinations or exotic software setups. This affected the most fundamental and universal way that hundreds of millions of people in 2026 organize and access their professional work. File Explorer, the Windows application you use every single time you open a folder, manage your files, navigate your storage drive, or access any document on your computer, also broke. KB5074109 caused File Explorer to begin ignoring folder customization settings encoded in desktop.ini files, silently overriding configurations that users and IT administrators had carefully established over extended periods of time. Custom folder icons, personalized view preferences, organized directory structures built up over months or years of deliberate configuration work, all of it wiped away by a mandatory security update that installed itself without asking. Microsoft acknowledged this problem in the Windows Release Health Dashboard with a status label indicating they were investigating, which in practice meant users were expected to wait indefinitely for a resolution. Sleep mode, one of the most elementary and universally relied upon features of any laptop or desktop computer, stopped working as expected for a significant number of users after KB5074109. Reports flooded into community forums describing machines that, after the update, would turn their screens off when commanded to sleep, but continue running at full power consumption underneath, generating heat, consuming electricity, and accomplishing nothing useful. Others described machines that appeared to enter sleep mode correctly, but could not be woken without performing a complete cold restart from scratch, losing any unsaved work in the process. Some users reported their machines rebooting spontaneously during sleep. One highly detailed report on the Windows 11 forum described the user's experience with clinical precision. When they attempted to put their machine to sleep, it would turn off the display but continue running. It could not be woken through normal means. When they eventually forced a full restart, the machine went through complete BIOS initialization, confirming that it was not resuming from sleep but performing an entirely new cold boot. That user spent 3 full days methodically testing variables and eliminating potential causes before confirming that KB5074109 was the single variable responsible. The moment they uninstalled the update, normal sleep behavior was restored immediately and completely. Remote desktop functionality, the feature used by IT professionals to administer systems remotely and by millions of remote workers to access their office computers from home, was also broken. Microsoft's own official support documentation confirmed that after installing KB5074109, credential prompt failures began occurring during remote desktop connections using the Windows app on Windows client devices. This issue directly impacted Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365, which are Microsoft's own enterprise cloud computing products, marketed specifically to organizations that depend on reliable remote access for their daily operations. The professionals most severely affected were the exact people who can least afford connectivity failures. IT administrators, managing organizational infrastructure across multiple locations, enterprise workers whose only access to their company systems is through a remote desktop connection. And now we arrive at the chapter of the story that received the least mainstream press coverage relative to its significance, and that involves some of the most expensive consumer hardware in the Windows ecosystem. Gamers and content creators using Windows 11 machines equipped with Nvidia graphics cards began reporting after KB5074109 that their GPU performance had declined dramatically, not marginally, not in a way that required careful benchmarking to detect. Users were reporting losses of 10 to 20 frames per second in graphically demanding games, with the most pronounced impact on what the gaming community calls 1% lows, representing the worst frame rate drops experienced during the most demanding rendering moments in a game. For competitive gamers whose performance depends on consistent, high-frequency frame delivery, for content creators who stream their gameplay live to audiences, for any consumer who spent $500, $800, or over $1,000 on a high-end Nvidia graphics card expecting that investment to deliver consistent performance, losing 10 to 20% of their GPU's effective output because of a mandatory Windows security update is a failure that deserves direct and public acknowledgement. Beyond the performance regression, users reported visual artifacts appearing in games and applications that had been rendering flawlessly the previous week. Graphical anomalies, rendering glitches, strange geometric shapes appearing unexpectedly in rendered environments. Users initially suspected newly released Nvidia driver updates that had coincided with the January 2026 timeframe as the likely culprit. Systematic testing quickly produced a definitive answer. Users who rolled back to older Nvidia drivers while keeping KB5074109 installed continued experiencing identical performance losses and visual artifacts. Users who kept their current Nvidia drivers but uninstalled KB5074109 saw their GPU. Performance and visual rendering quality return immediately and completely to baseline. The Nvidia drivers were not the problem. Microsoft's mandatory update was the problem. An Nvidia engineer named Manuel, posting in an official Nvidia community forum thread that accumulated thousands of replies, confirmed that Nvidia was aware of the widespread reports, acknowledged that the problem appeared to begin after a Windows 11 update, and stated that as far as his team could determine, the only available resolution was uninstalling KB5074109. An engineer at Nvidia, publicly instructing users to uninstall a Microsoft Windows update as the only known fix for a problem Microsoft's update had caused, is a level of cross-company dysfunction that should have generated far greater public and regulatory attention than it received. Microsoft's emergency response timeline tells its own clear story about the scale and severity of what KB5074109 had broken. On January 17th, just 4 days after the original release, Microsoft issued an out-of-band emergency update designated KB5074144, intended to address the most severe system lockup scenarios. Out-of-band updates fall outside Microsoft's regular monthly release schedule. They are deployed specifically when a problem is severe enough that it cannot responsibly wait 3 to 4 weeks for the next scheduled Patch Tuesday cycle. Releasing an emergency out-of-band patch within 4 days of a monthly cumulative update is a clear and unambiguous signal that something had gone significantly and undeniably wrong. On January 24th, 11 days after the original release, Microsoft issued a second emergency out-of-band update, KB5078127, specifically targeting the Outlook freezing, PSD file access, and OneDrive storage interaction failures. 2 separate emergency patches within 11 days of a single mandatory monthly update. And yet, even with both emergency patches deployed, the boot failure scenario on affected hardware configurations remained unresolved. The Nvidia GPU performance regression and visual artifacts remained unresolved. The sleep mode failures remained unresolved. The File Explorer customization breakage remained unresolved. Multiple critical regressions introduced by one mandatory update continued affecting real users on real machines, while Microsoft worked toward resolution in its standard development timelines. The practical steps you need to take right now fall into a clear and logical sequence. First, confirm whether KB5074109 is currently installed on your machine. Open the Settings application, navigate to Windows Update, and select Update History. Scroll through the list of recently installed updates and look specifically for KB5074109. You can also verify by checking your operating system build number. Open Settings, go to System, then About, and look at the OS build field. If your build number shows 26100, we'll want to set 7623 for Windows 11 version 24H2, or 26200.7623 for version 25H2. KB5074109 is installed on your device. If you're experiencing any of the issues covered in this video, the recommended path forward is straightforward. To uninstall the update, return to Settings and select Windows Update, then Update History, and choose the Uninstall Updates option. Locate KB5074109 in the displayed list, select it, and follow the uninstallation process. Your computer will need to restart to complete the removal. After restarting, verify in your update history that the entry for KB5074109 no longer appears as installed. Once the uninstallation is confirmed, use the Pause Updates feature in Windows Update settings to temporarily halt automatic update installation, giving Microsoft time to release a corrected replacement update that delivers the included security patches without reintroducing the bugs and failures that KB5074109 brought with it. For users whose machines have already reached the most severe scenario, where KB5074109 has caused the computer to fail to boot into Windows entirely, the recovery process requires accessing the Windows recovery environment. You can reach this environment by powering your computer on and immediately pressing the power button to shut it off again at the Windows logo screen, repeating the sequence 3 times in succession. After 3 interrupted boot attempts, Windows will detect the pattern and automatically redirect to the recovery environment on the following startup. Once inside the recovery environment, navigate through Advanced Options, then Troubleshoot, then Advanced Options again, and select the Uninstall Updates option. Choose to uninstall the most recent quality update. The system will attempt to remove KB5074109 and restore the device to its pre-update configuration. Windows Central published a comprehensive step-by-step walkthrough of this recovery process that I would strongly recommend accessing and saving before you need it. One important consideration: that responsible coverage of this situation requires acknowledging directly. KB5074109 did contain genuine patches for real security. Vulnerabilities, including 3 zero-day flaws that were actively being exploited by attackers at the time of release. Uninstalling it does temporarily leave your system without those specific security patches until Microsoft releases a corrected cumulative update that incorporates the same security fixes without the destructive bugs. However, Microsoft itself designated uninstallation as the recommended mitigation for affected users. The emergency out-of-band updates that Microsoft released separately address some of the critical security issues outside the problematic cumulative update package. The consensus guidance from independent security professionals is that for users experiencing significant operational failures caused by KB5074109, the risk to data integrity and system reliability from operating a malfunctioning system outweighs the security exposure of temporarily operating without those specific patches, particularly for users who maintain careful browsing practices and keep all other software current. Before we get to the action steps you need to take right now, it is worth stepping back and calculating the actual economic cost of what KB5074109 has done, because the numbers tell a story that Microsoft's press communications will never voluntarily share with you. Consider the scale of Windows 11 deployment globally. Microsoft reported that Windows 11 had surpassed the 1 billion active device milestone entering 2026, even if only 1% of those devices experienced significant disruptive failures. From KB5074109, that represents 10 million machines, 10 million people who lost productive working time diagnosing problems that Microsoft introduced, 10 million people who spent hours on community forums, support threads, and troubleshooting guides, trying to understand why their computer suddenly stopped working correctly after doing exactly what Microsoft instructed it to do. And 1% is almost certainly a significant undercount of the true impact. The Outlook freezing alone, which affected any user with a POP or SMTP configured email account, represents a category that encompasses hundreds of millions of users worldwide. Now add the enterprise dimension. Corporations running Windows 11 on managed fleets have IT departments that must investigate, diagnose, document, test, and deploy remediations for every significant Windows update failure. Each affected organization invested internal labor hours in understanding the KB5074109 situation, assessing their exposure, testing the emergency patches, and deploying fixes across their managed device populations. The aggregate cost in IT labor hours across the global enterprise community from a single problematic cumulative update runs into tens of millions of dollars conservatively. And none of that cost appears anywhere in Microsoft's financial reporting because it is externalized entirely onto the organizations and individuals who absorbed it. The small business impact deserves its own specific acknowledgement. A sole proprietor whose entire client communication workflow runs through Outlook, who woke up on a Monday morning in January 2026 to find that their email application would not open, had no immediate support structure to call on. They could not escalate to an IT department. They had no managed endpoint service watching their device. They had a broken email application, a list of client communications that needed responses, and a Microsoft support ecosystem that was already overwhelmed with identical complaints from millions of other users in identical situations. Some of these users may have missed deadline-sensitive client communications. Some may have been unable to send invoices on time. Some may have spent billable hours. They could not recover diagnosing a problem that was entirely Microsoft's responsibility to prevent. The aggregate economic harm to the small business community from KB5074109 alone is genuinely significant, and it is harm that Microsoft will never be asked to account for in any meaningful way. What this entire episode ultimately reveals extends beyond the specific failures of one update in 1 month of 1 year. It exposes a structural and cultural problem in how Microsoft approaches its relationship with the people who depend on Windows. The technology press has been reporting with growing frequency and urgency on what has become a recognizable and repeating pattern. A mandatory update is released. Widespread problems emerge across multiple hardware and software configurations. Microsoft's initial communications are minimal or absent. Community forums and third-party technology publications fill the information vacuum that Microsoft's silence creates. Emergency patches eventually appear, addressing some but not all of the introduced regressions. Users are left to navigate the gap between what is broken and what has been fixed, often without clear official guidance about which specific combinations of hardware and software are affected and which remediation steps apply to their particular situation. The question of why this pattern keeps repeating is one that deserves a direct and honest answer, because understanding the root cause is the only way to assess whether the situation is likely to improve or whether Windows users should be making longer-term contingency plans for their computing environments. Part of the answer lies in the sheer complexity of the Windows ecosystem. Microsoft is attempting to maintain backward compatibility and seamless operation across thousands of distinct hardware configurations, spanning processors from dozens of manufacturers, storage devices using multiple different interface standards, graphics cards with entirely different driver architectures, firmware implementations that vary wildly between device manufacturers, and software application environments that range from modern cloud-native applications to legacy business software written decades ago. No other operating system on the planet is attempting to do this at the scale that Windows does. Apple controls both the hardware and software in its ecosystem, giving it the ability to test updates against a precisely defined and limited set of hardware configurations before release. Linux distributions, while theoretically running on diverse hardware, have a user base that is disproportionately composed of technically sophisticated users who actively participate in pre-release testing. Microsoft is shipping updates to an ecosystem of staggering diversity and complexity, and the testing infrastructure required to catch every possible failure mode before mandatory deployment to 1 billion devices is genuinely an unsolved engineering problem. But complexity is not the complete explanation, and it is important not to let it function as a full excuse. Microsoft has the largest software engineering organization and the largest software testing budget of any company in human history. It operates an insider preview program through which hundreds of thousands of volunteer users test pre-release Windows builds and report issues before general availability. The problems introduced by KB5074109 were not exotic edge cases requiring unusual hardware combinations to reproduce. Outlook freezing was reproducible on standard consumer laptops running unmodified configurations. Nvidia GPU performance regression was reproducible on any machine with a current Nvidia graphics card. Sleep mode failures were reproducible on common consumer hardware. These are not the kinds of failures that slip through exhaustive testing because they require rare environmental conditions to trigger. They are the kinds of failures that should have been caught during standard quality assurance testing on representative hardware configurations before a mandatory update reached 1 billion devices. The gap between those two realities, the resource capacity to catch these failures and the apparent failure to actually catch them, points toward a prioritization and process question, rather than purely a technical one. When mandatory updates consistently introduce significant regressions across common use cases and popular hardware combinations, the responsible inference is that the testing and validation process preceding mandatory deployment is not adequately thorough. Not that the Windows ecosystem is simply too complex for quality assurance to function. That inference has implications for every Windows user trying to decide how much confidence to place in Microsoft's update pipeline going forward. One user on Microsoft's official Q&A community captured the cumulative weight of this pattern in a comment that resonated across the Windows user community when it was written. They described their experience of installing the January cumulative update, discovering the sleep mode failure it introduced, waiting an entire month for Microsoft to resolve the issue through normal channels, then installing the subsequent February update in hopes that it would finally address the problem, only to find that their computer exhibited the exact same sleep mode malfunction after the February update as it had after the January one. Still broken. After that experience, they wrote they were uninstalling the update and described themselves as now more seriously considering migrating to Linux than at any previous point in their years of using Windows. That is not the language of a casual complaint. That is the language of a long-term customer who has reached the end of their willingness to absorb repeated reliability failures from a company whose product they depend on for their daily productivity and professional livelihood. Here is your complete action plan. Open settings right now. Check your Windows update history for KB5074109. Check your OS build number for 26100.7623 or 26200.76223. If the update is installed and you are experiencing Outlook freezing, degraded Nvidia GPU performance, sleep mode failures, cloud storage application errors, File Explorer customization being overridden, or extended black screens during startup, uninstall KB5074109 immediately through update. History, restart your machine and pause automatic updates for several weeks. Monitor Microsoft's official Windows release health dashboard at support.microsoft.com. For confirmation that all known issues introduced by KB5074109 have been fully resolved before allowing any replacement update to install. If your machine is already in the boot failure scenario, access Windows recovery environment through 3 consecutive interrupted startups and use the uninstall updates pathway to remove the January cumulative update. There is one additional protective measure that every Windows 11 user who watches this video should seriously consider implementing as a permanent part of their update management routine going forward, regardless of whether they are currently experiencing any problems from KB5074109. That measure is creating a system restore point before every major Windows update. Windows 11 includes a built-in system restore function that allows you to take a complete snapshot of your system's configuration, registry settings, and system files at a specific point in time and roll back to that exact state if a subsequent change causes problems. 2. Enable and use System Restore. Search for Create a Restore Point in the Start menu, open the System Properties dialog, select your primary drive, click Configure, and enable System Protection. Set the maximum disk usage for Restore Point storage to between 5 and 10% of your drive capacity. From that point forward, before you manually install any major Windows update, or before Patch Tuesday each month, create a new manual restore point by clicking the Create Newest button in the same dialog. If a future update causes problems, you can return to System Properties, click System Restore, and roll back your machine to the pre-update snapshot within minutes, without needing to navigate the Windows recovery environment or risk data loss. This single habit, taking less than 30 seconds to execute before each update cycle, can save hours of diagnostic work and protect your productivity against exactly the category of failure that KB5074109 represents. For users who run Windows 11 in a business or professional context, whether as a sole proprietor, a freelancer, or an employee managing your own device, it is worth considering whether setting Windows Update to the option that notifies you before downloading and installing updates, rather than performing updates automatically in the background, is the right configuration for your situation. This setting, accessible in Windows Update settings under Advanced Options and then Configure Automatic Updates, gives you the ability to check community forums and technology publications like Windows Latest or Windows Central in the days immediately following a Patch Tuesday release before allowing any new cumulative update to install on your production machine. The professional Windows community typically identifies significant regressions within the first 24 to 72 hours after a new update's release. Waiting 3 to 5 days before installing a new monthly update costs you almost nothing in terms of security. Exposure, while potentially saving you days of productivity loss, if the update turns out to carry the kind of widespread regressions that KB5074109 delivered in January 2026. This story is not finished, and it will not be finished after Microsoft releases a patched replacement for KB5074109 either. Microsoft's update pipeline continues operating on its monthly cycle, and the subsequent February and March releases have already generated early community reports of new issues on certain hardware configurations. We are watching these developments in real time and will bring you the full analysis as each situation develops. If KB5074109 has affected your machine, share your specific experiences in the comments below. Every account that gets added to the public record makes it harder for reliability failures of this magnitude to remain underreported. Subscribe so you do not miss the next update. Share this video with every Windows 11 user you know before they install this update today, and we will see you in the next one.